The rain hadn't let up all morning. It fell in cold sheets across the dusty yard of the county livestock auction, turning dirt into thick, sucking mud. The sky hung low and gray, casting everything in a dull, metallic light that made the whole place feel forgotten. Rows of pens stretched across the lot, filled with restless animals, some pacing, others slumped in corners like they already knew their fate. Amid the usual cattle, goats, and donkeys, there was one horse that didn't belong. He was shoved into the last pen, half hidden behind a warped plywood sign scrawled with the word unwritable in fading red paint. The animal looked less like a horse and more like a ghost of one, his ribs pressing against his skin like they wanted out, legs trembling under his own weight, patches of fur missing as if life had been rubbed raw from him. His left eye was swollen shut, and a deep scar cut through the fur along his neck, thick and cruel. The kind of wound that told a story no one had dared to hear. Most folks didn't stop to look at him. He didn't make a sound. No desperate whinny, no restless stamping, just stillness. Like he'd learned the world punished noise. A voice broke through the rain. "Come on, Ellie. We don't have all day." A girl stood just inside the gate, staring at the pen. She was maybe 17, wrapped in an oversized army coat, her boots caked in mud. Her blonde hair was soaked, plastered to her cheeks, but she didn't seem to care. Her eyes were locked on the broken animal, wide and unmoving. "That one's not worth your time," the auctioneer muttered as he walked by, barely glancing over. "Damn near dead. Probably won't last the week." Ellie didn't answer. She stepped forward, the mud sucking at her heels. With each step, she paused just outside the rusted pen gate, her breath fogging in the cold air. The horse didn't move, didn't even look at her, but something in her gut twisted. She knew that look. She'd seen it in the mirror more times than she could count. The man waiting for her, a family friend named Roy, sighed loudly and stomped over. "Ellie, I brought you here for a project horse. Something you could train and maybe sell in spring." "That thing in there isn't a project. He's a funeral." She didn't reply, not because she didn't hear, but because she didn't care. She slowly reached out a hand between the slats of the fence. "Hey," she whispered. "I see you." For a second, nothing happened. Then the horse's ear twitched. Ellie blinked. It was the smallest thing, barely there, but it meant everything. She had spent years working with animals, especially those everyone else had written off. When her mother was alive, they had taken in rescues, one after another, wounded strays, abandoned foals, terrified dogs. Her mom used to say, asterisk, "The ones who won't look you in the eye, they're the ones worth saving the most." Asterisk. After her mother passed, everything had fallen apart. Her father had gone cold. The barn was sold off. The animals disappeared one by one. The house emptied. But Ellie had never stopped remembering, never stopped listening for the silent ones. She pulled back her hand and looked at Roy. "How much?" Roy's brows raised. "You're joking." "I'm not. You don't know where he came from, Ellie. Horses like this, they come out of fighting rings, or from people who use chains instead of halters. That's not a challenge. That's a death wish." She didn't blink. "How much?" Roy looked at the clipboard in his hand. "They're asking 200, but they'd take 50 just to get rid of him." She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded envelope. "I have 60. He stared at her like she'd gone mad. "You were supposed to use that to register for the youth rodeo next week. That money's your future." "This is my future," she said, eyes never leaving the horse. "The rodeo will still be there next year." Roy swore under his breath, but he waved the auctioneer over. 10 minutes later, the horse, now officially hers, was being led shakily into the old stock trailer behind Roy's truck. He collapsed once inside. They drove in silence. The only sound was the steady thunk of hooves against the trailer walls as the horse tried to steady himself and failed. Ellie sat hunched in the passenger seat, heart pounding. She hadn't even touched him yet. Not really. She didn't know if he could be ridden, or if he'd ever let a human come close. But she knew what she had seen in that pen. Not defiance, not rage, just quiet surrender. She named him Ash before they were halfway home. When they arrived at Roy's place, Ellie jumped down before the truck had fully stopped. The barn was old but dry, warm from the space heater Roy had installed last winter. She flung the door open and began preparing a stall with fresh straw and a bucket of warm ash, her movements efficient but gentle. It took both of them to coax Ash out of the trailer. Every time they tried to pull the lead rope, he froze or buckled. Finally, Roy stood back and let Ellie try her own way. She approached slow, whispering the whole time, "I know you're scared. I know people haven't been kind." She didn't touch him, just walked beside him, letting the rhythm of her voice fill the cold night. "I'm not asking for anything. Just a step." Ash hesitated, then moved. One hoof, then another. They made it to the barn before midnight. Inside the stall, Ash collapsed again. But this time, he did it without panic. Just exhaustion. Ellie stood by the half door for nearly an hour, watching him breathe. His sides rose and fell unevenly. Every few minutes he gave a tremor, like something inside was trying to crawl out. Roy brought her a blanket and a thermos of coffee. "You know this might not work, right?" She nodded. "He's broken. Too broken." She shook her head slowly. "No such thing." Outside, the wind howled. The storm was just starting to settle in, the kind that blew straight through your bones. But inside that little stall, there was a fragile peace. The kind built not from comfort, but from the shared silence of two creatures who had both been through too much and come out the other side still breathing. Roy left her to sleep in the hayloft above Ash's stall. She wrapped herself in the old quilt, listening to the sound of the horse's breathing, steady and low beneath her. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning, and beginnings were everything. The next morning, she entered the stall holding a halter. Ash looked at it, then at her. He didn't back away. She stepped closer. "This doesn't mean work," she said gently. "It just means trust." She let him smell it first, let him touch it with his muzzle. Then, slowly, she slipped it over his head. He didn't move, didn't freeze. He simply stood. Ellie fastened the strap beneath his chin, then stepped back, hard hammering. Ash blinked slowly, and waited. The next few days were filled with cautious steps, walking together across the pasture, learning turns, halts, simple movements. Ellie never raised her voice, never used a whip or pressure. Just voice, body, breath. Each time she asked something of him, she offered something in return. By the end of the third week, she brought a saddle out into the barn. Roy stood nearby, arms crossed, silent. "You really think he's ready?" Ellie didn't answer. She wasn't sure. But Ash was watching her, calm, grounded. She set the saddle gently on a stand and approached him with the pad first. He sniffed it. Stepped back once. Then forward. She eased it onto his back. No flinch. No panic. Then the saddle. She didn't cinch it tight, just enough to feel the weight. Ash stood still. Not rigid. Still. Roy let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be." Ellie didn't celebrate. Just stroked his neck once, gently. He's not ready to carry anyone yet, but he's not afraid. She led him back to the stall that night, speaking softly. "You did good." Ash lowered his head against her shoulder. It wasn't affection. Not yet. It was trust. And that meant more. Later that night, Ellie sat in her loft bed, legs curled beneath her, notebook in hand. She wrote every detail she remembered, every small victory, every flick of the ear, every moment where Ash chose to stay instead of flee. She had never been good at talking about her feelings, not since the funeral. But here, in this quiet barn with the wind curling outside, she found herself writing about her mother, about the days they spent rescuing lost things, about the silence that filled the house when the laughter stopped, about the part of herself that had gone quiet too. Ash stirred below, shifting in the straw. She listened to his breathing, slow and even. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. And for the first time, she believed healing was possible, not just for Ash, but for her too. By the second morning, Ash still hadn't eaten. Ellie crouched just outside the stall, fingers wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee. The horse stood pressed against the far wall, unmoving, as if the straw beneath his hooves might disappear if he dared trust it. The warm mash remained untouched in the corner, steam no longer rising from the bowl. "He's testing you," Roy muttered from behind, leaning against the barn post. Ellie didn't take her eyes off Ash. No, he's protecting himself. Animals don't play games. People do. Roy grunted, rubbing his beard. Could be pain. Could be he's given up. I haven't. She stood and stepped into the stall without hesitation, her boots muffled by the bedding. She moved slowly, not to avoid startling him. He didn't seem to startle, but to show him something gentler than silence. Her presence, her patience. Ash didn't flinch as she drew close. His good eye tracked her, dull but alert. Ellie knelt beside the feed bucket and scooped a handful of grain into her palm, extending it just far enough for him to smell. Just try. He didn't, but his nostrils flared once, catching the scent. She waited another hour before leaving. Each day after that followed the same pattern. Mornings began early, before the sun pierced the frost, and ended long after the last light vanished behind the hills. Ellie cleaned Ash's stall, refreshed the water, mixed warm mash by hand. She spoke softly when she entered, never trying to touch him. It wasn't time. He didn't know what hands meant yet. Maybe they had only ever brought pain. By the 5th day, he'd eaten half his feed. By the 7th, he looked at her when she walked in. Small things. But Ellie's world ran on those. She had always known patience wasn't passive. It was a decision, made over and over. Her mother used to say, trust comes in teaspoons, not waterfalls. So she measured out her care in teaspoons, never rushing, never reaching beyond what Ash gave. One afternoon, as a cold wind rattled the tin roof, Ellie brought in a soft-bristled brush. She didn't go to him with it. She sat cross-legged in the corner, humming tunelessly, brushing her own arm, letting the rhythm fill the silence. Ash watched her for 10 full minutes. Then, tentatively, he took a step closer. It was barely a shuffle, a drag of his front hoof across the straw. But Ellie felt her breath catch. She didn't move, just kept brushing, slow and steady. By the time the light dimmed, he was standing 2 feet away. He still didn't let her touch him, but he stayed. That night, Roy brought dinner to the barn, 2 bowls of stew balanced on a metal tray. He found her asleep in the stall doorway, her back against the frame, Ash resting quietly behind her, only inches away. "You're wearing yourself thin," Roy murmured as he set the tray down. Ellie stirred but didn't wake. Her arms were folded across her chest, and the faintest smile tugged at her lips, the kind that came from dreaming of something better. Roy glanced at the horse, who was watching him with a narrowed eye. Not fear, not aggression, recognition. The next morning, Ellie opened the stall and found Ash waiting for her. Not in the corner, not frozen against the wall. He stood by the door, and when she lifted her hand slowly, open-palmed, he leaned forward and brushed his nose against her fingers. It was brief, a whisper of contact, but it shattered something inside her, not with noise, but with light. From then on, progress came faster. Ellie introduced gentle grooming in short sessions, always letting Ash walk away when he needed to. His coat began to thicken with good food and warmth, revealing a dark, dappled gray beneath the filth and scabs. She treated the cuts on his legs with ointments and soft cloth, learning the exact threshold of touch he would tolerate. Still, he didn't make a sound. No whinnies, no snorts. He was eerily silent, as if his voice had been locked away. After 2 weeks, she led him, without ropes, into the paddock for the first time. The air was sharp with early frost. The trees beyond the fence stood bare and brittle. Ash stepped onto the field like the earth might bite him. Ellie gave him space, standing far off as he tested the grass, with tentative hooves. For a long time, he didn't move beyond a few feet. Then, without warning, he bolted. It wasn't graceful. His legs still trembled when he moved too fast. But he ran. Ellie watched, breathless, as his muscles bunched and stretched beneath the gray coat. He circled once, then twice, not looking at her, but not running from her either. It was the first time she saw him alive. Not surviving, but alive. When he finally stopped, sides heaving, he turned toward her, just for a moment, then lowered his head to graze. That night, Roy stood beside her at the fence, watching Ash chew thoughtfully under the moonlight. "You ever think you've done enough?" Ellie blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean he's better. You've brought him back from whatever hell he came from. Maybe that's all he needed. She shook her head slowly. He's not whole yet. He walks like he's waiting for the blow. You think he'll let someone ride him? I think he'll choose. Roy let out a long breath. That's not how it usually works. I know. But she meant it. Ash would decide. Not because she was afraid to push him, but because he needed to know he had power now. That not every hand reached to control. The storm rolled in just after dawn. Ellie had been walking Ash through the back pasture, hoping the crisp air and soft dew might loosen his stride. He still moved stiffly in the rear legs, a lingering memory of mistreatment more than injury, but he followed her now with gentle obedience. The halter rested loosely on his face, more symbolic than functional. He didn't need it. He stayed because he wanted to. Thunder rumbled behind the hills, slow and distant. Ash froze, ears flicking toward the sound. It's all right, Ellie whispered, resting a hand on his neck. Just the sky talking. Another rumble. Louder. Ash tensed beneath her fingers. His eyes darted, not wild, not panicked, but calculating. Then lightning forked over the tree line. The world went white. Ash reared halfway, not high, but enough to unbalance his front legs. His body twisted, backpedaling sharply. Ellie stepped aside quickly, giving him space, not yanking the lead rope. Her voice stayed low and calm. I'm here. No one's going to hurt you. I'm right here. Ash halted, chest heaving, legs spread like a colt learning to stand. For a breathless moment, the storm and the horse both held their energy in suspension. Then the rain came. Cold, sudden, sharp as needles. Ellie reached for him slowly. His muscles twitched under her touch, but he didn't pull away. Together, they walked back to the barn, heads bowed against the downpour. Roy met them at the gate, had pulled low. He didn't bolt, he noted, watching Ash shuffle into the stall. He thought about it, Ellie said softly, but he didn't. Roy chewed the edge of his mustache. I'll count that as progress. Ellie dried Ash with a rough towel, working in circles to warm him. He stood quietly, tail twitching, coat steaming in the barn's warm air. Thunder still grumbled overhead, but it didn't shake him like before. She wondered what images the sound conjured for him, what memories it reached in the dark corners of his mind. That night, Roy found her sitting on the tack bench, elbows on her knees, staring at nothing. You all right? She didn't look up. He almost left today. It would have been so easy for him. But he didn't. I don't know how long I'll have him. I don't know if this ends with someone else buying him and breaking him again. Or worse. Roy lowered himself beside her, joints popping. You're not just worried about the horse. Ellie's silence answered for her. She hadn't spoken of the letter. It came from her aunt's attorney 2 weeks ago. The ranch land, the barn, the fields, the only home she had left, was not entirely hers. Her aunt had been drowning in quiet debt. Unless Ellie found a way to cover the outstanding balance within 3 months, the property would go to auction, just like Ash almost had. Roy knew. Of course he knew. But he never asked what she would do. The next morning, she saddled Ash. He stood still as she cinched the girth and adjusted the stirrups. His ears flicked once when she swung the saddle into place, but he didn't step back. He didn't lower his head in avoidance. She didn't mount him. Not yet. Instead, she led him to the arena and walked in wide circles beside him, letting the saddle move with his body. He walked easily now, weight distributed evenly. The limp had faded, or he had decided it no longer mattered. By the end of the week, she introduced weight on the stirrups, leaning gently across the saddle, letting him feel her presence above him. He stiffened at first, but each time, she dismounted and praised him. No force, no pressure, just steps. On the 8th day, she climbed into the saddle. Ash stood motionless. Ellie didn't ask for movement. She let him breathe, let him adjust. Then, with a light squeeze of her calves, she asked. He walked. Roy watched from the fence, arms folded. I'll be damned. Ash moved like he remembered. Not perfectly, not without hesitation. But he didn't buck, didn't balk. He carried her the length of the arena in a straight, steady line. You've got something special there, Roy said quietly when she dismounted. Ellie ran a hand along Ash's neck. He was always special. He just needed someone to wait. But special wasn't enough. Not now. Not with foreclosure looming and no answers on the horizon. 2 nights later, Roy handed her a flyer. She unfolded it slowly, frowning. The Allstate Gentle Horse Challenge, /$25, 000 grand prize. She stared at the paper. Her breath caught in her throat. You're joking. Roy shook his head. You've got 3 weeks. They allow reformed rescues, judged on trust, partnership, and obstacle navigation. If any horse has a story to tell, it's him. Ellie looked at the photo. A sleek horse gliding through a complex pattern of barrels and bridges. Polished. Confident. Perfect. Ash wasn't that. But he was something more. He's not ready. Roy met her eyes. Maybe he is. She didn't answer. Not right away. But that night, she walked into the stall and sat in the straw beside Ash, holding the flyer. I don't want to ask this of you, she whispered. But if we win, we keep the ranch. We keep our home. You'd never have to be afraid again. Ash didn't move. Then he stepped forward and lowered his head to her lap. She signed up the next day. Training began in earnest. Every morning, they worked through obstacles, poles, ramps, fake water hazards. Ellie made makeshift bridges from barn planks and stacked hay bales into winding corridors. She rewarded progress, never punished failure. Ash learned quickly, not with robotic precision, but with quiet understanding. He listened to her voice, felt her cues. They were building something rare. By the second week, he trotted in rhythm with her breath. He stopped when she shifted her seat. He backed with a tilt of her hand. Roy watched them in awe. He doesn't obey, he said one afternoon. He partners. Ellie didn't respond. Her throat tightened too much for words. The night before the competition, she couldn't sleep. She laid in the loft above the stall, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creak of Ash shifting below. The storm in her chest was louder than any thunder had ever been. At dawn, they loaded the trailer. Ash stepped in without hesitation. At the grounds, the other horses gleamed. Coats polished like mirrors. Braided manes. Expensive tech. Ash stood quietly by the rail, rough-coated but proud. Ellie stroked his cheek. We don't need to win. Just show them who you are. When their number was called, Ellie walked him into the arena. Spectators lined the stands. Judges stood at attention. The first obstacle was a bridge. Ellie gave a quiet cue. Ash stepped forward, hooves solid on the boards. Next came a weave through barrels. Then a tight turn through hanging streamers. He faltered once, startled by the fluttering plastic. But Ellie didn't push. She waited, and he moved again. When they reached the final challenge, a small platform he had to step onto and stand, Ellie dismounted. She didn't lead him. She stood back. Ash looked at her, then stepped onto the platform. The crowd fell silent, then erupted. When the scores were tallied, Ellie stared at the numbers, unable to breathe. They'd won. Roy laughed so hard he nearly dropped his hat. You did it, girl. You both did. Ellie turned to Ash, tears in her eyes. We're going home. That night, back at the barn, she let him out into the pasture. He didn't run this time. He walked, then turned and waited for her. She joined him, and for the first time, he lowered his head until it touched her chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't obedience. It was love. And it had saved them both. Morning mist curled along the fence line like breath held in suspense. The ranch was quiet, as if the land itself was waiting. Ellie stood in the doorway of the barn, a hot mug of coffee cupped in her hands, watching Ash graze near the pasture's edge. Since the competition, people had begun calling the ranch. Some wanted to know if Ash was for sale. Others asked for training sessions, interviews, photos. She hadn't returned any calls. Fame hadn't changed Ash. He still walked to her when called, still leaned his head into her shoulder, with quiet trust. But the world had seen him now. The scars on his body had become symbols. His past, a story people wanted to own. Roy leaned against the post beside her, arms crossed. You've built something real here. That kind of bond doesn't come from ribbons or prize money. Ellie nodded, her eyes never leaving Ash. I don't want people treating him like a miracle they can buy. He is a miracle, but he's not for sale. And neither are you. She smiled, tired. The ranch is safe now. The debt's paid. We even have a little extra. I should be relieved. But, she sipped her coffee, staring into the steam. What if this isn't enough? What if we go back to being invisible? Roy tilted his head. You're not invisible. Not anymore. You reminded people what second chances look like. Before she could answer, the crunch of tires on gravel echoed up the drive. A dark green pickup rolled to a stop by the gate. A man stepped out mid-40s, wearing jeans too clean to be local and boots too stiff to be trusted. He held a folder in one hand and a camera slung over his shoulder. Press, Roy muttered. The man waved. Hi there. My name's Carter Rowe. I'm a journalist with the National Ledger, hoping to speak with the girl and the horse that turned a whole competition upside down. Ellie set her mug down. We're not looking for publicity. I understand, but it's more than that, Carter said. This story, it means something to people. I think if we tell it right, it could help other horses, other girls. Ellie hesitated. She looked at Roy, who gave the smallest shrug, his way of saying the choice was hers. Fine, she said at last. But Ash comes first. If he doesn't like you, the story's over. Carter followed her to the pasture, respectful and quiet. Ash watched them approach but didn't flinch or retreat. When they reached him, he sniffed Carter's hand, then turned to Ellie and huffed softly. He approves, she said. Carter spent the afternoon asking questions about the auction, about the training, about the debt. He never pushed, never dramatized. When Ellie paused, he waited. When Roy added a detail, Carter scribbled it down without interrupting. But it was when Ash leaned against Ellie mid-interview, resting his chin on her shoulder like a sleepy child, that Carter put down his pen and stared. I've never seen anything like that. Ellie smiled. Neither have I. The article ran a week later. The title read, The Girl Who Listened, and the Horse Who Answered. It went viral in hours. Messages flooded in. Rescue centers across the country thanked her for bringing attention to discarded animals. Survivors of abuse wrote letters about what Ash meant to them. And slowly, Ellie felt the weight she'd been carrying shift. She wasn't just saving one horse anymore. She was helping others find the courage to start again. With donations and volunteer offers rolling in, Ellie decided to convert part of the ranch into a small sanctuary. Nothing big, just a few stalls, a stretch of pasture, and a safe place for the horses no one else wanted. Roy cleared out the old equipment shed, and Ellie painted the door herself. She named it Ash's End. Not an ending, she explained to the first rescued mare that arrived trembling in the trailer, but the end of fear, the end of pain, the start of something better. They called the mare Lark. She had hollow eyes and a body built on silence, not strength. Ash greeted her gently, walking beside her in the paddock, never too close, never too far. Within days, she began to follow him. And then, one morning, she approached Ellie without flinching. You're doing it, Roy told her. Ellie watched Ash nuzzle Lark's side. He's asterisk doing it. More horses came, each bearing different scars, some visible, some not. Ellie worked with them slowly, refusing shortcuts, learning their language. She didn't ride any of them. Not at first. Not until they asked. By winter, 5 horses called Ash's End home. The barn, once too large for just one girl, now buzzed with gentle sounds, soft whinnies, shifting hooves, breathing that didn't sound like fear. But with growth came new decisions. Carter reached out again, offering to document the sanctuary's progress in a short film. Ellie hesitated. I don't want to turn this into a brand, she told Roy. But it is a story, he said, one that keeps writing itself. So she agreed. Carter's crew came in spring. They were kind, attentive, and quiet around the horses. Ash, now with a thicker coat and stronger frame, walked beside Ellie for much of the filming. They captured his transformation in slow, respectful detail. One evening, as they wrapped up the final shots, Carter asked, What do you want people to remember when they see this? Ellie looked at Ash, then at Lark, who now stood confidently by the water trough. That it's not about saving. It's about believing. These horses, they don't want pity. They want patience. They want to be seen. Ash stayed at her side through it all. He never again showed signs of his past fear. Not when trailers pulled in. Not when storms rolled overhead. He had found home, and in doing so, helped build one for others. But even as the sanctuary thrived, Ellie sensed a restlessness in Ash. He had more to give. One evening, Roy found her walking the fence line, Ash close behind. "You're thinking something big," he said. She nodded. "He needs a purpose. Not just to heal, but to teach." Roy scratched his chin. "Therapy. More like outreach. Kids. Vets. Survivors. People who think they're beyond fixing." Ash nudged her gently. Roy grinned. "He agrees." And so a new chapter began. Twice a month, Ellie and Ash traveled to local schools and rehab centers. Ash stood calmly as children brushed him, as veterans laid trembling hands on his coat. He listened without judgment, offered silence where others offered solutions. At one center, a boy who hadn't spoken in 6 months wrapped his arms around Ash's neck and whispered, "You understand." Word spread again, not through headlines, but through hugs, stories, quiet miracles. Late one night, after returning from a visit, Ellie sat beside Ash in the stall. "You've changed more lives than I'll ever know," she said softly. He leaned his head against her, warm and solid. She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming knowledge that from the moment she'd pulled him from that muddy pen, something beautiful had been set in motion. And it wasn't finished yet. They still had more lives to touch, more darkness to light, more proof to offer that being broken doesn't mean being beyond repair. It only means you're ready for someone to listen. And Ellie was still listening. The film was called More Than Broken. It premiered online with little fanfare, but once again, the world paid attention. Donations tripled. Applications to adopt poured in. Ellie remained selective. She wouldn't let any of her rescues go unless the match was perfect. And some, like Lark, she knew would never leave.